Well, but our slides will be up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's even better.
Okay, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Good morning. Welcome to our February parent webinar series through the Idaho Federation of Families. I'm Carol Dixon. I'm a family coordinator for the Federation. And today we've got a really great presentation for you. The title is Growing Up, Staying Safe, and the Journey to Adulthood. It's a great topic for so many of our families whose kids are going into adolescence and dealing with a lot of the issues that have to do with social media, kind of their own physical development, and really getting out there socially and dealing with some of the challenges that they face in the world among kids, but also some of the things that are happening on a larger scale. So we're bringing today two of our, some of our favorite people. Angela and Jen are incredibly dynamic, impactful advocates in the state of Idaho. They've done a lot of work that has made a difference. So Angela is the executive director of Idaho Parents Unlimited, and Jennifer Zielinski is the director of the Idaho Anti-Trafficking Coalition. So ladies, thanks again. You've been here with us a couple times, and I think your information is always important, and we are excited to have you talking on a topic that is, and it really expands beyond families with kids with mental health challenges. This is important for all families and all children, so it can be used in multiple ways. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to you all. I know you've got a lot of information, and actually in hours, we were just saying, is kind of a short time to try to pack it in. So kind of buckle your seatbelts and hold on, because they've got a lot to cover.
Thank you,
Great.
Carol.
Thank you.
Yeah, getting through an hour with Jen and me when we have so much to say can be hard. I wanted to just say this training was developed, the Journey to Adulthood is a training that was developed for parent centers, and Idaho Parents Unlimited is the statewide parent training and information center for the state of Idaho. And it was developed about 10 years ago, and it actually did not cover a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about today. So much has changed with the digital age for our kids, so we've added in a lot of information. And Jen, if you want to explain maybe your background and why the Anti-Trafficking Coalition, what your role is in this.
Yeah, so a fairly new coalition, been around for about 8 months, and transitioning from Idaho Parents Unlimited for the past, I don't know, over 6 years.
We're not going to let her get away.
Now I found myself in this new role as the director of the coalition, where I think some really specific goals moving forward with education and awareness, and ensuring that victims and survivors of trafficking in Idaho receive appropriate services, treatment, education, housing, and so we have a variety of community members, a part of our team, that are just amazing advocates and work statewide to offer all of these services. So whether they're providers, whether they're nonprofits, whether we're partnering with the hospitals or local law enforcement, and schools especially. So really getting this information out there. The coalition is eager to have anyone participate who wants to get out there and really just make a presence and become aware of the trafficking signs, symptoms, and the risk factors for our kids, especially those who become targets online. So we'll get into all of that, but I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, great. And so Carol did mention that this is really important information for families. This is for any of our kids. However, we are going to be talking about those additional risk factors that come with our kids who have certain disabilities, including mental health disorders.
Right.
Those where risk factors are much greater at times for some of the dangers of today's digital technology and also things that are happening just in their day-to-day social lives. So let's go ahead and start the slideshow. The first part of this presentation is really just going to talk about some of the changes that parents can be having conversations with their kids about as they are growing into adolescence, becoming tweens and teens. Some of the physical changes and emotional changes, and really the conversations that really go into the fact that society has different expectations for adults. A lot of times we, as parents, may treat our kids as adults because they maybe sometimes sound more like adults.
Yep.
But they are not, and so we really do need to remember all of that when we're having those conversations with our kids, that they're being exposed to many other things, maybe
Right.
that we weren't, especially growing up fast.
Yep.
Exactly. So let's go ahead and, are you able to
Yep.
put
I'm
the
moving
slides
on.
there? All right. So some kids recently asked these questions. They have the questions about going through puberty.
Especially those who maybe struggle with the social components, those who may have come from a background where they've been exposed to trauma or abuse or neglect. They don't know what to expect as they're growing up. We also have kids who have a dual diagnosis of maybe a developmental or an intellectual disability and a mental health disorder, where it really impacts or skews their understanding of the natural process of development. And so it's important to be able to answer those questions, be the kind of parent or resource where you're an open book. You'll answer those questions. Obviously, you'll determine which how you monitor those things, but be present, be available, and so that starting at a young age, we remove that stigma. We really become an equal partner with our kids as they're growing up, because it is scary. And so paying close attention to those who maybe are developing on a different level.
So there is in a second you're going to see a chart, but there is the arrival of puberty. It actually, it's between 8.5 and 13, and 8.5 may seem really young, but our kids are entering puberty at a much younger age, and they are entering the online. They're accessing online digital technology and social media at an even younger age than their bodies are developing. And so
Right.
those two really are connected, and that's really important.
And that can create a skewed understanding for them. So where they may have an image of older women or even men, so they think their bodies should look a certain way, and have this expectation where now we start to see certain insecurities or really tapping into a new world where maybe they're not accepting their own natural development just the way that it is. So monitoring, we'll get into that, but really monitoring the what our kids are accessing in order to maintain that level of age appropriateness.
Absolutely.
And this chart here,
So this is the adolescence timeline for girls, and it just kind of gives you a broad range of when certain things will happen for those physical changes
Right.
that will occur. This chart and then the next chart for boys, did you pull that one up? Both of those are going to be available. I should just mention there will be some handouts, and I'm going to go through some of those, but including these charts, those will be available in a couple of different formats. We're going to make them available for you when this is archived on YouTube through the Federation, and on their site there will be a link to all of the handouts that we talk about here. And then also, I'll also make sure that we have those linked at Idaho Parents Unlimited's website. And then if all else fails, you could just contact us and we can send them to you. So a lot of different ways to get access to these.
but these are good. These charts are a wonderful opportunity for just parents to be aware. Maybe these are the age groups in which you can pay close attention to these things. Kids don't automatically know what those changes mean, so they have to be communicated. And I remember when my older kids were growing up, they now report that they got a lot of their information from their friends.
Right.
And we all know that that's probably not accurate.
Usually it's not.
Especially if they're starting at 8,
No,
9,
we had
or
some
10.
really interesting conversations about what my kids' friends told them.
Right. Yeah. So you want to
normal.
ensure that they're getting accurate information.
Yeah,
they
but-
know what to expect.
And Jen, that just goes right back to the being an, and it comes up in the training too, being that askable parent. So
Yep.
the
Yeah.
fact that we had those conversations, well, yours are reporting maybe some stuff now, but I know my kids, again, what's age appropriate?
Mm-hmm.
Those conversations need to be age appropriate, but I know, thankfully, I was open enough that my kids came to me with questions. They always
Right.
asked, and sometimes those questions were really, they took me off guard, and I thought, oh my goodness, I don't even know how I'm going to answer this one.
Right.
But you
Yeah.
know, you've got to be willing to have those conversations with your kids in the most age appropriate way as possible.
Well, and it definitely ensures a higher level of safety, because once it's not a form of stigma where they're afraid or ashamed, I know that we must respect the culture of each family's house, but just know that with that accurate information, ensuring through obviously an appropriate level of development and understanding, that we prepare them so that that fear factor is removed, and then also the secrecy. And
yeah, it's really important, because you do develop that. If you're having these conversations with your 8, 9, 10-year-old at whatever level is most appropriate, by the time they're hitting 15, 16,
Right.
17, hopefully you've built a good, strong enough relationship that there's that trust built in.
Right.
So one of the things, I know we kind of skipped over the last slide, but real quick, you know, we talked about, real quick, the talking to your children about what are private and public is really, really important. I had somebody also tell me the other day, they were talking about how when there could be abuse situations.
So when you have a group of professionals working with your children, I would say this is so critical in some of our kids, where you might have personal care services,
Right.
or you might have
a lot of doctors.
community worker, or a lot of doctors. It skews the understanding from the child of who is allowed to have access to their body and who isn't. So really important to set a structure of separating a team of professionals versus those risk factors that can happen from other individuals, unsafe people. And so really paying close attention to how we talk to our kids, and just allowing people to have access to our body. It definitely, I can say for my daughter, who has significant mental health and behavioral disorders due to neglect and abuse, and some genetic history of mental health disorders, has an intellectual and a developmental disability. And so there isn't a line for her. She doesn't understand the boundaries with people that are appropriate in having access to her body. So those would be, you know, our doctors and our specialists, and then those who don't. She cannot separate the two. So it's really important that when we're talking about grooming and toileting and dressing and all of those things, that as they mature, that we're really identifying those boundaries, and then who.
And maybe it comes up in another slide, but if just in case we missed it, I wanted to at least touch on the point of using actual body parts, using their names. It may be uncomfortable, but better than using a name for something that somebody else might not know what that is, and then not identifying when some sort of abuse might be happening.
That can definitely pose a risk
Yeah.
if a child is trying to explain that someone may have inappropriately touched them, or asked to touch them or somehow, and you're using a false name for that part, it's extremely difficult to figure out exactly what they're talking
It
about.
might be, it just may be missed and going on for quite some time. So parents do need to realize that using appropriate actual names for body parts is really critical to a child's safety. So I wanted to also touch on a little more on this grooming and just hygiene and those kinds of things that may come up. I know that our kids with mental health disorders may have some issues with caring for themselves, like you mentioned, the boundaries, self-awareness, those kinds of things. A lot of our kids are maybe missing some of that, or they just don't seem to care about it.
If you have, I know with Chelsea, despite all of our efforts in really pushing for appropriate grooming and hygiene, her mental health disorder just interferes with that. It takes over, and especially where there's a cycling process within her mental health, and a lot of anxiety, a lot of highs and a lot of lows. The last thing on her mind is hygiene.
Right.
And so really paying close attention to her body changes, for the need for grooming, and again, having that safe person who is able to really care for that. But that is going to hopefully translate in later years when she's able to really do that, individually and independently.
We're going to talk a little bit more about that, and I'm also going to give some more information on some handouts on some strategies. So, but we'll get to that in a second. So we just want to real quick, there's some tips right here that you can see on how to talk, some of the things to talk to your daughter about, and how to teach certain public and private considerations,
Right.
and how to practice those skills before they're needed. And again, those are going to be in the handouts that I'll talk about in a second. The same goes here. The next slide is on talking to your son. I think that a lot of times, because girls, girls go through they begin menstruation and starting their periods, and so we have
an
maybe
open
right.
conversation.
So we tend to have these conversations because it's coming, right?
Sure.
And then
right.
it arrives, and then you're going to need to teach about how to manage that.
Yep.
We don't necessarily think about having those same types of conversations with our sons,
Right.
and we need to be having those conversations with
I
our sons.
agree. We definitely need to consider these things because some of these things can be scary. So especially if we have kids who are really dealing with anxiety or depression, and so where they may be somewhat isolated or private, these may not be conversations that they're having with their parents. And so definitely ensuring that they understand this is normal, these are things that do happen, and having that open dialogue. A lot of these things, the anticipation can be scary, but that first time that something like this happens can be shocking. And then they can feel ashamed. A lot of times if they don't know what it is, that's where that shame comes in. And so really having these conversations with our sons the same way we would prepare our daughters.
Yeah, and actually, just taking that a step further, everybody, again, your family may be different than mine, but, and it maybe makes a difference in that I have both boys and girls, but the conversations in my house, even with my son, included the development of girls and how they develop and how boys
Absolutely.
develop with my daughter. So, I think it's really important that we talk to our kids about the development that occurs in both sexes.
There's a natural curiosity factor. And so I know with my 6-year-old, she's curious because she has friends who are boys and she has friends who are girls. And so trying to separate the differences and identify them. And so right now she's not ashamed of any of that. And so that whole process in communicating with her, giving her an understanding of the boundaries, but yes, there are differences, and these are the differences. And definitely identifying her development and her understanding, so making it very age appropriate. But her curiosity is innocent. And so then as she starts to develop, we start talking about safety, and we start talking about awareness, and then we start talking about having access to safe people. So it's a natural process you really want to engage in, so that she doesn't just automatically start feeling like this is shame, that this is a natural process.
So the next conversation that can come up is self-touching. And so we see now, maybe not with our kids with mental health diagnoses, but we definitely, a lot of kids with certain developmental disabilities have no awareness of those personal self-awareness and the boundaries of what's appropriate in public or in private. And they can really put themselves at risk if they are doing things in public that are just not socially appropriate.
They can definitely so we've seen a lot of kids who've come from trauma, who have early onset of serious emotional disturbance, and then you potentially have an autism diagnosis or some type of a developmental disability where they just simply don't understand some of the behaviors in public versus some of the behaviors that they would do maybe in home. They just don't have a line.
So those have to be those have to be taught.
They have to be taught.
And again, this is for all of our kids, but I will say that when teaching our kids who have those added risk factors for safety or self-awareness or those types of things, we just need to remember that that the safety, not just for themselves, but they could be at risk for getting in actual trouble with the law.
We definitely need to pay attention to activity on the bus.
So
or in school,
really
in classroom. Those are things where if we and we have to work really hard. So that's where your therapies come in. That's where maybe your interventionist or your community worker really focusing on those appropriate behaviors. We've seen a lot of risks with students in the classroom. There's a zero tolerance there.
Right.
And even kids who maybe have been victims of sexual abuse. I know with Chelsea, my daughter, who is a victim of sexual abuse, this became a habit of hers. And it can become very self-soothing. That can actually, especially if there's been a trigger of trauma. So paying close attention to this. In her case, it became a form of self-mutilation, and so really understanding where this is coming from, and then creating those appropriate boundaries.
So in teaching some of these things, and I want to bring up the fact that there are a lot of things that we need to teach if our kids, again, aren't able, it's things that may seem really natural or that maybe do come naturally for a lot of kids. For a lot of other kids, they don't come naturally. And
Right.
so I know that with one of my kids, I would have to say, okay, I recognize certain things weren't going to come naturally. And I would have conversations with her about, you're not, maybe you don't feel these things or know or think these things. So I am going to teach them to you so that you know them. And we would actually have that type of a conversation where I'm going to teach this.
Right. Right.
I would say those words.
Right.
I'm going to teach this
Sometimes,
because I want you to know. And so there are, so one of the handouts that we're going to provide for you is something called Tools Parents Can Use. There's not a slide for this, but it's a little guide. I think it's about 10 pages, and it gives strategies for some of these teaching tools that are listed. There's actually 10, but 3 of them that maybe are up on the screen there are the task analysis.
We'll pull it up right now.
Is it there? Okay. So task analysis, that's breaking down a task into a series of smaller steps. And again, you might think that it's natural to know you do this, then you do this, then you do this.
Right.
But some of our kids are thinking, well, I did this, and then they want to jump to step 4,
Right.
and they're missing steps in between. So that's what task analysis can do. Parallel talk,
Yes.
that is actually talking about something as it's happening. So you're saying, okay, right now, you can be saying it with them, you can be asking them, okay, what are you doing? What are the steps?
Right.
Or you can be saying, so right now you're doing this.
It's alongside them.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then finally, storyboards. And that is a series of pictures and illustrations that can be used for breaking down teaching. And at a younger age, I did this with my youngest, it was necessary. In a lot of different things, some of our kids have issues with executive function and organizing and anticipating and thinking ahead.
Right.
And so one of the things that I learned I needed to do with her was create storyboards. Picture charts worked really well for her. So I would have the things that needed to get done each morning so that we could get out the door. Right. And so it doesn't matter what the topic is, but you can use that concept. So we would have, go take a shower, get dressed, brush your teeth, then make your bed, go downstairs, but before creating that storyboard of activities, every day was a battle.
Right.
And so using those tools can be really beneficial. It stopped the battle. And then we were able to use that same strategy as she got older in a lot of other topics, like, again, teaching hygiene.
Exactly. I was going to say, this could actually translate into that hygiene topic where maybe in those specific areas, so in the bathroom, you have that step-by-step process. Especially for girls who, maybe brand new to menstruating. So what does that process look like? To kids who need to be groomings, there's a lot of kids who maybe don't or just refuse to wear deodorant. Something as simple as deodorant.
Yeah.
And so
a lot of times our kids, they just don't realize that they smell.
They don't realize that they smell. That's true.
And then we have to tell them you do, because if we don't tell them and we don't get that into them as they're entering puberty, unfortunately somebody else is going to tell them, and then it's not going to be.
And that can be
good.
part of their morning routine.
Right.
And then the showering component as well. And so all of those hygiene things can really be a process of a storyboard. And that way, maybe they're checking it off or they're identifying, I did this.
It doesn't have to be pictures, but that's one way to do it.
It could be a list.
It's a list for a lot of kids. I'm a list maker. I live by lists. So
yeah. It can, anything that can help remind them of the process.
Right.
And you definitely want to be able to accommodate whatever needs they have.
So the next part of the presentation we're going to start to get into is we're going into the social needs of our kids as they enter the teen years. And we're going to be getting into a lot of that digital age. We're going to be getting into some pretty heavy stuff that Jen will be also sharing with us about risk factors for trafficking and you would
online
think that
safety.
Online safety, yeah. And you would think that those types of things don't happen maybe here in Idaho, but it's becoming more and more prevalent. So
it is.
So when talking about social needs, all kids have a need for belonging. Everybody wants to belong. Unfortunately, for a lot of our kids, they will glom on to people who seemingly accept them when they might not be the right social group. And they could find themselves in dangers as a result.
And I can say, so speaking just about Chelsea, I'll kind of touch on this, but reactive attachment disorder, just lack of boundaries, really inappropriate. So a false understanding of the difference between a family member and a stranger. To her, there is no difference. So it makes absolute sense for her to walk into a public setting and sit on somebody's lap. It is totally appropriate for her to walk up to somebody and ask to have their food or hang out with them or participate with them. She would automatically jump into somebody's car. That safety component of her significant mental health disorders are a huge issue when it comes to that process. Right. So we'll just pull up the screen so we can get some...
So developing adult social skills, really, these are your life skills, and there are so many issues in developing social skills, especially with today. so many kids are online. I mean, our kids, their faces are just in their phones. And so
Always.
developing those appropriate social skills for your actual physical interactions
Yep.
really needs to be taught at this point. They're in school, and most of our kids are in school, and they're getting the social interactions with each other. But are they being taught what is expected of them as
Right.
they go into adulthood?
Well, and it is complex. And so some of the things that I've experienced even with having that mental health component in our home is a process in which that we would just train and teach on those social skills. But we would incorporate role setting or role playing and goal setting. We would definitely model. That was something that we did with Chelsea in particular because she has a dual diagnosis. We would focus on repetitiveness, really repeating over and over and over, and also creating habits almost. And so once, if she were to actually cycle, where she's really high, we would deal with bouts of mania, so a lot of manic behaviors. So we would try to stay very consistent in that. So if she's really high, we're still modeling that same behavior. We're trying to we're trying to instill a habit. And so then if she's really low, we still have that habit in place. And that would ensure some of the those teaching moments.
We also need to remember that a lot of our kids maybe struggle with social skills. I mean, they truly, not just
Right.
learning them, but they struggle with social relationships and knowing boundaries. We have kids that talk too close, talk too much,
Right. Yeah.
say the wrong things sometimes. Maybe say things that seem very that are very literal, but then are offensive
Yeah.
without realizing that those are things that we
And they start to notice that. But some of the mental health pieces that I would say become aware of is being overstimulating. And so oftentimes these conversations, especially as we're setting some rules and expectations, that pressure in itself can induce anxiety. It can induce depression, especially if they're already dealing with that. So pay attention to that isolation piece. So how are these conversations and expectations and that natural process in growing where maybe their body's growing and developing and changing, but maybe not emotionally.
Right.
And so paying attention to the triggers, how does this impact them and affect them? So you may want to just really do it in a step-by-step process.
This is really important too, because without the proper social skills teaching for a lot of our kids with mental health disorders, they then become at risk as targets for bullying.
Right.
And so, and
Absolutely.
then you can see all of those things that you just talked about are then exacerbated.
Definitely,
So,
especially if there's frustration, irritation. So you have, your peers become irritated or frustrated by those tendencies. So it's really difficult. And then maybe somebody like Chelsea who doesn't even recognize bullying.
Yeah, and,
where
thank
she
you for-
becomes a target.
Yeah.
And then now she's an easy target.
Thank you for bringing that up,
Yeah.
because I do remember at one point when my daughter was younger, she we were talking about bullying, and she said that there were no bullies in her school. So she was
Oh, yeah.
completely unaware. And at the same time, I had a teacher tell me that the other kids tolerated her very well.
Right.
So, so I'm thinking, there's a big disconnect there.
They
So
become
we had to
easy
teach.
targets.
Yeah.
And so that's where they can be made fun of. They can be used as an example for, just inappropriate interactions. They become targets.
Right.
And easy targets.
Right.
And so really that's going to be part of that skill building process. But teaching cause and effect, teaching self-awareness, all of those things, very, very lengthy process.
Okay, I think I'm just going to skip through that because I think we covered that
Yeah.
pretty well. So getting into those personal safety skills, we talked about a lot of this already. I'm going to buzz ahead on a few of these slides.
Yeah.
You'll have access to all of them. So a lot of it is just informational and stuff that I want
Yep.
families to have. But it is also really important that we get to this other half of the presentation before
Yeah,
we run
and
out
this
of time.
boundary chart I think is a really good opportunity for a starting place.
The
If
boundaries
you-
chart is also going to be part of the handouts, and so people will have access to that. And this is a great thing to show, work with specifically with your child to
Yep.
show the circle of.
Yeah,
I mean, we've seen
it's-
these
it's a good
circles of
visual.
support. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So now making it real.
Yeah.
So this is where we're just going to recap. This is using those teachable moments, be present, but model good hygiene.
Yeah.
Oftentimes our kids, especially at a younger age or developmentally at a younger age, they're going to pay close attention. And so
that's where even some of that parallel talk can come in.
Right.
I can say,
So modeling
this is
it.
what I'm doing each day.
Yep.
Just so I want you to see, this is what I'm doing each day. I get this. You'll notice I take a shower every single day.
Right. You notice I brush my teeth.
I
This
sure
is
do,
how I
right?
take
And so
care of
those are the
myself.
kinds of things
Yeah.
that we can talk about. So
Definitely. And then one thing I do want to say, because I
go
did
ahead.
struggle with this, now just in hindsight and looking back, Chelsea's 12 now, but when she was younger, I kept thinking, she's capable of doing this. She has a mood disorder, she has severe behaviors, so she's capable. And I remember not accommodating as much. Where now that I look back, I think really what would it have hurt if I did accommodate those behaviors more, meaning that come up with creative ways to accommodate it. I know that I've come in contact with a lot of families where maybe bladder control or the hygiene for menstruation, things like that, where the conversation, there's a boundary there where the conversation between diapers and between pads, what do we do? And this has come up a lot, especially if you have that mental health mood disorder that becomes a barrier to good hygiene, and then the behavioral component. And so how do you separate all of that? So I would say, just in my own learning experience, make those accommodations.
Yeah,
It makes life easier.
It's interesting that you say that, because I talk a lot about the fact that, when we talk about our kids transitioning to adulthood,
Right.
and we talk a lot about there's no magic behind, you're suddenly 18, and now
Now
you're
all of a
supposed to be able to
sudden,
do
yeah,
all this stuff,
right.
right? And we talk about this extension of adolescence. I think we need to remember, too, that just because your body is changing,
Right.
doesn't mean that you don't need an extended teaching
Exactly.
time for your social and emotional
That's exactly
skills.
it.
And so,
And I learned that.
supporting that,
Yeah.
I think, that's a good lesson to share. So
And here, just pre-adolescent development.
these are just some of the stages that you would see
Right.
for parents, right? You will hopefully see increasing modesty, but you might not.
You might not, and so modesty may have to be learned, taught.
I agree.
Very
I agree. Again,
significantly.
where we're dealing with some kids that have a limited self-awareness,
Yep, boundaries.
modesty isn't there. Also, some of our kids who have had multiple caregivers in their lives.
Right.
It
warps that understanding.
Right.
In our house, we're huggers. We hug family. We
I'm
hug
not.
friends. We now know
Anybody who
not
knows
to hug
me,
Angela.
fist bump. Okay.
But
And I don't have any trauma. I don't know why I don't like to hug.
it became part of a natural understanding and a process for my kids who don't have significant disabilities. But my one child, Chelsea, who doesn't have that understanding, she wasn't able to separate that.
Right.
And so the rules had to be different with her.
Right.
In that she would just hug anybody. She would hug everybody because that was what our family did. But she didn't understand the line. She didn't know where those boundaries were. So we really, we identified the need to separate that, especially with her. The other kids.
And there just has
grew
to be a
understand.
conversation with our kids about these things. And like you said before, it's repetitive. You may have this conversation again and again and
We
again.
still have the
Yes.
conversation with her, and she's 12.
Yeah,
And so we will continue. It wasn't too long ago that walking into Target, she went and just sat down with complete strangers, engaged, and within seconds she was just gone. So there's a risk factor to that, and so constantly instilling those safety strategies.
And we've already covered adolescence development
so
pretty
we
well.
will pull up
So now we're
why
so,
preparation
yeah.
is critical. This is important. And so it's important because as they start to get older, kids are accessing social media. We are accessing, we're going to get into that, but this is the starting point of why we're saying prepare for this. Once kids start to have access to things, especially if they identify that they're inappropriate, they could potentially want it more and more and more. And so then they seek. And so once they start seeking, there opens the door to those risk factors. Now they're getting into a potential world where they're maybe not capable of understanding the differences between risks. What are those safety concerns of maybe accessing, unfortunately, accidentally accessing pornography sites or inappropriate sites where they might find intriguing or interesting. And so now we could potentially be on this path where some parents just aren't even aware of. If kids aren't trained and aren't taught about online safety, then they could potentially become a target for that. So keeping students safe online. We really need to pay attention to our kids who have those mental health disorders. Those are, it's critical that we pay attention to that isolation piece and cycles of depression where they may start to become more and more involved in this false world. And that world in itself is dangerous because now they may start learning about adults and people in ways that aren't real.
And our kids are, again, the original training was created 10 years ago, and none of this information was included. So what has changed in the last 10 years with access? We've moved on from Facebook, for goodness sakes. None of our kids are on Facebook. Well, they are. They say they're on there so that they can be connected to their parents and their grandparents, but they're not really on Facebook.
Not true.
And so keeping kids safe online goes, as parents, we're going to say, well, on Facebook, they're way beyond that. And they're beyond that at much younger ages. Our kids are accessing online material through their games, through different apps on their phones and on their iPads, and they're accessing all sorts of apps, people. They come in contact with lots of people they don't know, and they don't realize how dangerous it is, and parents don't realize it because they don't even know the app exists.
And it can have, and these things can have emotional impacts on them where they don't realize that now they may be developing obsessive compulsive behaviors. I need it. They're feeding off of it. They're somehow getting their needs met by this fake world or these fake worlds. They think they're interacting with real or legitimate people, and so it could actually create more worry and more anxiety, and so that isolation piece is really important.
And I think parents cannot be afraid to monitor their kids' accounts and devices.
We're going to get into that. So
great. I know that a lot of people, they're even with my kids. So just my kids are one is 22 as of today, 20 and 18. And so in the last 10 years, they grew up in this,
they did,
right?
Yeah.
And so there was a time when, and I'm sure this happens with parents too, you get this whole trust factor. Well, you don't trust me. Why are you looking at my stuff? You don't trust me.
Right.
I don't trust the world out there and what you might have access to. And it doesn't matter how much I love and trust my kids. I'm going to do my job in keeping them safe. I don't need to be their best friend, or I don't really care if they're mad at me over that.
That is a really good point.
I'm going to keep them safe.
Because a lot of people say, well, kids should have access to their own private things or, respect their privacy and those types of things. And this really is, that's important. Expressing and explaining to your kids that this is about a very, very scary world. And not everybody is a danger, but being prepared and understanding that, so parents really paying attention to what kids are doing. These are different types of security services or apps or even part of your network, but you can look these up. Some you can pay for that have real detailed ultimate protections. Some really prevent, especially if you're already dealing with maybe a youth who is accessing some online risky things, and some of that behavior is noticeable. I had a friend tell me about this circle with Disney, and she said that it actually prevents her child from downloading apps because she was downloading apps that were inappropriate. And so all of these different things can offer different types of parental control, access. I would say I've looked at most of them. They're things that I need to implement in my own life with my own child. And but all of them may be already added into your network. So whatever company you're with your phone system, some of them are for any form of social media. So it could be within your email, and there's across the board. It's not just phone and iPad, but it's within the computer as well. So paying attention to those. And then here's your age-based guidelines. So these are things to really keep as far as principles. And
again, this slideshow, you're going to have access to this. Some of these slides that are now and coming up are really text heavy, but they contain really important information that we want you to have, even if we don't talk about all of it, because we're going to run out of time.
Yeah, we are. But these are some ideas that you can instill within your household. And so keeping the computer in a public area, create a list of internet rules. All of these things are just, they're guidelines, and it creates good habits within the home. But the addiction itself to online activity, those can lead to risks. And so if we're not paying attention to what our kids are accessing, then we don't know that they potentially enter into these risk factors.
Right.
And so age-based continued is paying attention to behaviors. I know that in the past, I've seen an increase in behaviors when my child was accessing inappropriate things. I saw a shift in her behaviors.
Yes.
And so that whole gaming part of it as well, we need to pay close attention that that's also a potential risk. That is the number one place that kids are targeted from potential pedophiles, from people who are reaching out to them, trying to gain a relationship with them, and it leads into some very shady areas. But gaming is the number one place that they do that.
So I want to just share a quick story, because I am allowed to share stories about my daughter. She gives me permission. So being 18, I do need her permission to do that. But there was a time, I think it was her junior year in high school, so not too long ago. She was still active on Facebook at that time. She's moved on, like I said. But I discovered one night, because this talks about teaching them not to interact with people they don't know. So this is really important for parents. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and somebody hit the like button on her profile picture that she had changed that day. And this person was very different. I didn't know him. He looked really a strange name, like a
Right, just an unusual name.
No, it was like a made up name. Anyway, I clicked on the profile, and I was like, who is this guy? And he wasn't from Boise, and he was an adult. And I started to go through her whole friends list. And over the course of the night, by morning, I had discovered there were at least 12 men from either other states or other countries that were friends with her on Facebook. And so I asked her about it that morning, and she said, well, they were friends with so-and-so. And I said, well, so-and-so is as naive as you are, because they don't know them either. And so this is a problem, and we need to make sure that we're not friends with people that you don't know personally. And part of the reason for that, as we go back to that self-awareness, she says, well, nobody could access me, or they wouldn't be able to find me. And I said, all somebody has to do, you've got pictures there, you tell where you go to high school, all somebody has to do, especially if they have a mutual friend, is say, so-and-so and I are going to lunch, do you want to meet us?
Yes.
and you're in the car. You're
Right.
gone.
Yep.
You're gone.
Yes.
And she knew that at that moment when I told her that. She kind of had this epiphany like, yeah, I would be gone.
Right.
And so that was a real eye opener for both of us
It
to
is a
say,
huge
you gotta have,
concern.
got to pay attention.
And a really good example. And the next few slides that we're going to try not to rush through, but we'll get through them. So we'll pull up what parents can ask. We're going to lead into some pretty
And we've got
deep
about 10 minutes.
and potential dark discussions. And this is because now in my line of work, we target addressing the victims of trafficking. And so our focus is sex trafficking, and that would be kids and even adults who are now involved in what a lot of people think are maybe an underground issue, or not really in this country, maybe out of the country, or maybe maybe people think it's just a labor trafficking type of an issue. It's not. So moving forward with the next few slides, it's really important to pay attention to what those online risks are. And so starting with what parents can ask, because there are quite a few statistics out there, high number of students reporting that they've been asked to maybe send a nude picture. Someone has sent a nude picture to them. These things are happening ongoing, and they're very, very serious. So here are some warning signs. And this is not just for youth, but these are just warning signs for anyone, where they start to become really secretive or angry.
Yeah,
If they
when you
don't-
talked about that behavior change,
Yep.
if you see big personality changes in your child, yes, their personalities are growing and developing along with puberty. However,
Right.
if you see something, if your radar goes up, that's what I always say, when my radar's up, I'm usually right. And I have had my radar go up with two of my kids
Yeah.
as they went through the teen years. And some of these things were occurring.
Right.
You know, there were things happening where they were hiding things and getting angry over things. And
They're
things.
withdrawing.
Yep.
If they immediately change the screen when you enter into
Yeah.
the room, if they're hiding,
It's a giant red flag.
huge red flag. If they're getting angry because they can't have access to their phone or their computer, those are some signs to pay attention to. And now we're going to get into some of the different issues that our kids face that maybe we never faced when we didn't face these types of things. But cyber stalking, could potentially be an ex-partner. This could lead to identity theft. This is somebody who can they can impersonate you, or they're impersonating somebody else, and they're stalking you. This is actually I've heard of opportunities for them to tap into your GPS, and they could stalk you at your school, the kid's school, or at your work. Now all of a sudden it starts to turn into a real threat. They will pay attention to your social media. Where did you just check in? I checked in online at the local coffee shop, so they know where you're at. And now once you start you're on their radar, you're somebody that they've targeted, they're not just stalking you, it translates into, there's a purpose to it. And it definitely is occurring, and it's occurring often. Social media stalking, I do want to touch on this just for 1 second, is not the same. If somebody's just looking up your profile and they're looking up your pictures, I think we're misusing that word.
Yeah, I was going to say that's not really even stalking.
social
I mean, we
media
joke and
should-
say, I'm going to stalk that. I got to see what this person's about.
Right.
You know, but that's not the
That's
same.
not a threat, and that's not illegal.
Right.
Cyber
Right.
stalking can turn into a criminal activity.
Right.
And so really paying attention to that definition, you can look it up. There are some great breakdowns of how to identify the cyber stalking, how to shut it down, how to report it, all of those different things. But catfishing is something totally different. This is somebody who's fake. They have a fake profile. They're a fake identity. Oftentimes, they are doing it to seek money. And people with disabilities are a prime target for catfishing because they can often be very trusting. They think that they're dealing with the exact same, the real person.
It goes right back to that feeling needing to belong. And so if you are
getting attention, you now have someone really reaching out to you. It can be someone claiming they're a classmate. It can be someone claiming that they are a friend of a friend, and now all of a sudden you have this complete stranger pretending to be somebody, and they start to woo you. They are complimenting you, they're giving you, they're manipulating. The sole purpose is to manipulate, and that can actually lead into some serious issues, and that can turn into
well, that's where you end up meeting. That's where all of a sudden you've got your child meeting up with somebody who's not who they were, or pretending to be.
Yes.
And so
once you do a Google search, oftentimes I think most of us do this on Facebook. At least as adults we do, but we go and we directly look at their profile. We see if they have multiple pages. You can go into those Instagrams and the profiles for Instagram. You can really look in to see if this is a real person.
Yeah, are they having real conversations with real people? Are their photos being liked? Are there comments on their photos?
How many friends do they have? If they only have 6 friends and there isn't a history, then no. So you can definitely go back and you can really look into if this is real.
These are really important too. Yeah. I mean, this is, so as our kids reach, again, 17, 18, where they're even more of a target at that point because they believe in their own heads that I'm an adult.
I can make my own decisions.
I can make my own decisions and those kinds of things. And if they are dealing with some mental health diagnoses where they have been isolated or have been struggled with social relationships, now all of a sudden you've got somebody who is
falling into a trap.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Super dangerous. And then do you want to touch on, right here, I know we've got a little more on catfishing, but do you want to touch also on grooming? Because we don't have a slide on that.
Yes.
And the different type of grooming, not the grooming we were talking about with hygiene. This is a different.
So catfishing can lead into a potential grooming issue where there's somebody online who has targeted you. Oftentimes it is our teens. It's our young kids.
And so grooming can take place with real people with real profiles, not necessarily.
Sure. Yeah, they can. It can be anybody grooming them. It's all online. And grooming is when they start to give you this, there's a false world, promising things, showering you with the potential. So you can have everything. I'm going to give you the world. You're going to, I'm going to shower you with gifts, and you don't have any responsibilities, and you don't have to go to school anymore, and you don't have to listen to your parents anymore. And really, grooming is when they, it is in the form of manipulation, but when they're really, really emphasizing this amazing world that you can access.
And some of you may know or saw the article just recently about the American Airlines employee that saw all the red flags of those two girls trying to board a plane to go on this great trip, and they both said they knew. I think the police officer said they were going to be trafficked, and the girls, young and naive, still said, "Well, that we wouldn't have let that happen."
Right.
And the police officer said they likely would not have had a choice.
Nope.
And so,
and they would have been gone.
So they were
at that
groomed.
moment.
They were groomed and promised things.
They were, and these girls were ready to board a plane.
They were getting on a plane
to leave to meet this individual. So despite the level of awareness, it isn't enough. We have to pay attention as a society. So all community members, not just putting the responsibility on parents, but in our schools, in our communities, in our churches, everywhere we have to pay attention to the significance of grooming and catfishing. That is where our kids become prime targets.
And our kids, so our kids with mental health disorders, our kids who have had early trauma, our kids who are in foster care.
Yes, so that'll come up here
okay.
in just a minute. So
Just prime targets, though.
they're prime targets, and they
Right.
are, and studies show that.
Yeah.
These are kids who come from a tough background, and it doesn't have to be that way. When grooming is successful, it could be for any
Right,
demographic.
right.
It can be for kids who are living in an extremely healthy environment. It can be kids who you would probably think have everything.
Right.
It doesn't matter. That certainly doesn't discriminate. But yes, those who are in and out of foster care, those who have a family history of maybe drugs and alcohol abuse, maybe homelessness,
Kids who are aging out of
who are
foster
aging
care.
out of foster care, absolutely prime targets for grooming. So we'll pull up the slide for cyberbullying.
And we'll try to get through it because I know we're right at the hour, but I think we're given a couple extra minutes.
Yep, go a couple minutes more. But cyberbullying is real. It can turn into criminal activity.
I'm sure we've all seen way too many, way too many stories of kids who have faced the online bullying that has led to the most tragic outcome of suicide.
So cyberbullying is one of the number one causes. It's top for suicide among our teens. And this is something to take very seriously. This is meant to be harmful. It's meant to be hateful. It's meant to be mean. It's ongoing. Oftentimes, kids are subject to horrific behaviors where maybe their profile pictures or their online pictures are now dispersed and they're made fun of. It's really a vicious act. So cyberbullying is something to be taken seriously. Sexting, so these are things I would say part of those polls. If you really want to look at statistics, you can just look it up. Health and Human Services, the U.S. Department of Education, they all have a breakdown of what kids are reporting, and there's a high number of kids who have reported sending inappropriate or nude pictures. And this leads to a very serious issue. We do know that law enforcement across the country are tapping into cell phones and looking at this kind of activity. And again, this is something that can turn criminal.
Yeah.
They consider this to be a form of child pornography, especially those who are underage. And distributing it or even creating it, you now have an issue of an individual who is now involved in this criminal activity, especially if multiple students or multiple people are putting this out there.
Or seeing,
Or even seeing it,
yeah.
participating in it.
Yep, whoops.
And so some things that parents can do to protect their kids, it's going to go back to starting that conversation, removing that stigma. You don't want to have your first conversation when you find a nude picture. You want to be able to have this conversation ongoing as children develop so that they become aware of the risks and aware of how serious it is. And I would say in talking about a lot of these components of starting at a young age, we want to talk to our kids about safety, and we want to talk to our young little boys about how to treat girls and girls in that modesty piece. And we want to really instill these things in our kids at a young age.
Because once things get to this point,
It spirals,
yeah.
but they're already potentially involved now in criminal activity,
Yeah.
where you just can't even fathom.
Well, in the
your
worst
son.
case scenario too, also I saw something the other day, I think it was on Megyn Kelly's show on
yeah, I
Today,
saw that.
and there was just the most unfortunate story of a mother whose son had shared a nude photo of himself, and shortly after doing that, this was part of maybe that catfishing that you were
Turns
talking
into
about.
blackmail.
So yes, so now extortion. This person
right.
was then having this young man send money,
Right.
and no amount of money was ever enough, and he didn't tell anybody. And he truly, truly believed that this was going to destroy his life because they kept making threats that they were going to expose this.
Right, they were going to
So
expose
this one picture of him, caused his suicide.
Right.
It led to, and so
It's tragic, and it's something to take seriously.
Yeah.
Especially once it does start to spiral out of control. Trying to gain that control.
Well,
is
especially
so
in their
difficult.
adolescent minds, where they don't realize that even if you have somehow gotten involved in some of this stuff, if you don't have the ability to tell somebody,
Right.
because you're so afraid of what it's going to mean, what that can then lead to.
Right. Be that present
Yeah.
parent.
If you have gotten involved in some of this activity, our kids, they have to have a safe place to share, so that there can be, so that it can be resolved and
Absolutely.
there can be treatment.
Yep. So we'll pull up
Couple
tips
extra tips.
continued. Yep. And this just some types of options on your phone I've seen where you can disable the ability to attach things. So really looking into all those parental control options, and sometimes we have to put those boundaries on our kids' activities just for those safety opportunities.
And don't misunderstand. This isn't about. Hopefully, this isn't creating just massive paranoia in everybody. And parents are running and with their hands waving in the air. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do with my kid's phone? I had no idea.
Yeah.
Which is that's a good thing too. But at the same time, this should not be construed as helicopter parenting or any of those things. It really is about being smart about what your kids might have access to
Monitoring.
and how to protect them.
And safety.
Yeah.
These tips for online safety, these are just some really good opportunities for you to communicate with your kids. And these are things to pass on. I would say having our kids share their passwords with us as parents only. Kids to parents only,
Right.
to nobody else. But then changing those passwords frequently, that can ensure some safety. And then learn those online search engines, and then the online games. Ensuring that they're not being hidden from you. And so that way you're involved. You're aware of the activity, and then continue to have those conversations. So when we talk to our kids, we do need to emphasize the need to be appropriate on the web. Those pictures are forever and can be retrieved even when they're deleted. And so many times our kids don't believe that, but it's true. They can be retrieved.
Well, and where they're posting and what they're saying and how they're saying it. So I recently discovered my daughter had posted a comment on some I don't know, some other page, like on a news article,
yeah.
And I thought, well, that's interesting that she put herself out there like that. You don't do that, so
right.
because you don't know what you're posting and where you're posting it and how it can then be shared.
And that's true.
So and what that can
Constantly
lead to.
communicating. So we're going to kind of finalize this
Yeah.
training by just touching on trafficking today. And according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 1 in 6 runaways are either already victims or are potential victims of trafficking. And that is, I think about 68% of them were those runaways were actually involved with social services or within CPS, so in foster care. And according to those young people, they report that their life in trafficking is better than the current life that they have. And that tells us as adults that we're not supporting them enough. We need to really talk about systemic changes as far as access to treatment, comprehensive education and skill building training, vocational rehabilitation for work, for employment, for education. And we need to create a system of wraparound services to protect them so that they don't think my life being trafficked is better than my life in foster care or at risk where I am right now.
And I think we talked about earlier today, a lot of that again, it goes back to that feeling of belonging and
It does.
and it's a little bit of that gang mentality, right? Like we join that because they're they accept me. I'm accepted here.
They're being accepted, but this is they are being coerced. They are being brainwashed. They are being tagged. They are forced. It starts off with a sense of love and security. Oftentimes it can be a boyfriend. In Idaho, a really large population of family members selling their loved ones to maybe support a drug habit, or it becomes just part of their culture where they've grown up, where buying and selling people to have access to money or drugs is part of their culture. And so prevention is really important, paying attention to these things. And I will say that despite what maybe our everyday worlds look like, these are kids who are going to school with our kids. Mm-hmm. And it is critical that we start becoming aware of those signs, really, really being aware of the need to engage and be active when it comes to trafficking in Idaho. How can you get involved, and how can you become more aware? And so recognizing these key indicators, paying attention to the signs, and I would say reach out to Idaho Anti-Trafficking Coalition. We'll be participating in all community efforts and moving forward with this hot topic.
So last two slides are just resources for you all. And then I know we have to wrap up. We're really running way late, but I wanted to share the other handouts that you'll access online. Besides the tools that parents can use, there will be a sheet on recommended reading for some books and things that for parents and also for youth. Mm-hmm. And then there's another form on creating an action plan for safety and awareness of development.
Yep.
And so with that, sorry we went so long. As usual, we have a lot to say.
Yeah, we do.
Going long
much.
is not a problem at all. And it's a tremendous amount of information they're trying to cover in a really short period of time. Yeah. And I think for me, one of the takeaways is honestly, I think there's a lot of parents are naive. We talk about the kids being naive, but I know so often if we aren't aware of things, we just assume they're not going on. And we also think that being hidden out here in Idaho somehow makes us a little bit safer, that we're not living on one of the coasts where the really big cities are, and this is where all those kind of things are taking place, that they're not taking place like in our community and in our state. And
it's happening. So it's happening in our schools. It's happening in our communities. These are kids. These are families and kids that we go to church with. Mm-hmm. These are families and kids that we attend activities, or we're at parks and a variety of things. They're our kids. They're among our communities. And Idaho's a transient state, and so oftentimes kids who are now become victims of trafficking, they're just driving through. So targeting our hotels, targeting our truck stops. It's really important to pay attention to these signs.
Yeah. So that common saying, power is, or knowledge is power.
Yeah.
So I think the more that we as parents become aware that this is existing, and start looking for some of those, red flags, but also those conversations, particularly that you talked about with our kids, is the biggest way to protect our children.
Start early.
So, I hope everybody takes this seriously, and it doesn't wig us out and make us scared.
Right.
Again, it just makes us a little more prepared to help our kids as they go wander into the world.
Exactly.
So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Love it when you guys come and just
you.
all this information that you throw on the table in a very quick, concise way. Next month, we don't have a date yet for our March one, but I'm really excited because we are going to do one on the juvenile justice system. And we're going to bring a parent in with us at the same time who has experienced going through the juvenile justice system. So it'll very much be that conversation of kind of, this is how it's supposed to work, this is what the system looks like, but at the same time with a parent being able to ask questions and talk about where they have run into obstacles and what they often parents don't understand about the justice system, and then also what you need to do to really be prepared. for the best outcomes as you're going through juvenile justice. So once we get a date on that, we'll push that information out through many ways. So again, I think Angela talked about that there is information that's going to be posted both on the Federation website. It'll also be on the iPool website.
Yep.
Great resources to go and get and keep, because as time goes by, you might want to reference them going forward.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you.
Love having you guys here. And we'll see you all next month. Thank you much.
Yay.
Nice. Thanks. Was it?
Yeah.
Okay. We,
And
a little
you
more
know what? And I
relaxed than last
loved, because you did bring it so much back to, again, that vulnerable population,
Yeah.
where it's applicable to everybody.
It is.
But
Do you want this? You can keep that. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, it is.
no, it's